Welcome to the UUCT live stream period. Our service will be starting in about 8 minutes. I accidentally said period after my first sentence because I'm so used to voice to text.
Ah.
That's awesome. Whoops, it's still live. We heard all that too. Okay, well, we're
It's
showing
human.
us right now.
It's
We can
human.
Switch to camera or tell us when you want to switch to whatever. What else did you have? You have some welcome music?
The gathering music played a few minutes before 10:30.
Okay, like 5 or 3?
Closer to 3.
Okay.
I just wanted to see what's going on in here. So.
You can't see this part yet.
Oh, good. It's all a blur.
We did turn, oh, you were there when we turned the sound down.
Yeah, that was good. That was good. Because that would be jolting, even if you wouldn't know the words, but it would be jolting.
It'd be harder on cable to do.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Oh, yes.
Estimation of family.
5.5. Yeah, minutes long. But it can go over the 10:30. I just want it for people. Yeah.
Reverend Samantha was trying to blow out the Canterbury mascot. I just thought of that.
That was totally, that
Darn,
was
it didn't
real.
work.
That was real too.
Oh, yes, I could tell. Actually, if it had worked, she would have had a really rousing mask.
Yeah, I would have been worried if it didn't.
Yeah.
Just making sure. So you're gonna light the chalice. You'll also extinguish it during my words.
Fine.
Okay.
I will remember to take off my mask before I get
If you don't, it's cute. If it don't, it's the joy of it. And you're gonna be there. Is that the right height for you? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so I have it pointed right where the camera.
Perfect. I think that's it. Good morning, and welcome to this service of worship at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tucson. As many of you know, my name is Reverend Bethany Russell Lowe, and I have the great honor and pleasure of serving as your settled minister. Our community is as varied as the blooms of the Sonoran Desert. Whoever you are, whoever you have been, whoever you are becoming, I invite you to bring your whole self here and now. I extend a special welcome to any visitors and invite you to fill out a guest information card. Mary Weiss is going to post one in the YouTube chat right now. Everyone is welcome to gather after the service at social hour on Zoom as usual, soon after the service ends. And Mary is also going to post a link to the YouTube chat for that sometime near the end of the service. And this is where those welcome words we used to read each week, every Sunday, become too different to be adapted. Even after all this time, nearly 18 months, things are still not back to normal. It's very evident here. There is so much to grieve. So let us grieve. Grieve that the before times are behind us and that the uncertain future is still ahead of us. Grieve the time lost and the years gained. Grieve the disconnection and the isolation, the loss of loved ones near and far through death or other means. We are all grieving not being able to be all here back together. And our grieving, as you know, does not look or feel the same. Some of us are angry. Others of us have accepted that this is what is best for now, and still others of us are somewhere in between. Know that I grieve along with you. And also know that I am working with staff and your board of trustees to create new policies that can be flexible to meet the ever-changing circumstances of this pandemic. These policies were created to help us ease down the path towards a multi-platform gatherings and more in-person gatherings. They will take into account, I promise, both the need for some of us to join in person sometimes, and also the reality that many of us will need to join meetings online for a while now. These guidelines will help us navigate the transition to a new multi-platform congregational life. And you'll see in worship this morning a micro movement down the path towards that multi-platform worship. There are 10 of us here in Holland this morning. You'll only see 2 of us, but we have Reverend Carla Stone-Brockie here, our custodian Jesus, my little baby Otis, and a childcare provider, Kaylee, is there for him. We have Jody Bergedick, our bird president, and we have our fabulous, wonderful live streaming crew, Cassandra Klein, Larry Newhouse, and Cynthia Johnson. We are the only people here in this space. And I hope that you will find your own way to extend a special appreciation to our live stream crew. They have done a fabulous job of getting us live streaming again, and their work is not done. So please find a way to thank them in the weeks ahead. And you'll notice that most of our worship leaders this morning have chosen to pre-record their pieces for the worship, and you'll see those on videos. They made this choice because they personally cannot take the risk of being here physically, and or because they have made the decision to not expose others to the risk their families are taking. We are trying to model here and experiment with how we balance inclusion and flexibility as we move forward towards multi-platform congregational life. And if watching this first live UUCT service in a long time, if seeing people in our space brings up something that feels too large for you to hold on your own, I want you to know that we have someone here for you or there for you. We have a chaplain in the wings. Reverend Julie Olson, one of your CUPS leaders, will be on Zoom throughout this worship service to be there to listen or hold the big feelings with you if you need to process there instead. And Mary has a link to that Zoom space that she'll put in the chat now. It was also in the e-blast this morning. And alongside all that grieving, I want to invite you to find space to feel the joy too. The joy that we are here, still alive. The joy that our community is resilient and has settled into new ways of gathering. The joy that arises from the conviction, maybe it's yours or maybe it's someone else's, that we will survive. And we might just even come out stronger in the end. There is so much in the air. There is so much still to be said. There is so much still unfolding. It is good to be together here this way now. Almost 20 years ago, on Sunday, September 16th, 2001, clergy across the country looked up from their scripts and tried to offer some words of hope. 5 days prior, as you know, our country saw a terrorist attack unlike anything experienced in half a decade. And we went to church. At least I did, or maybe you did too. Maybe you did some other ritual to take a deep breath while surrounded by other people who wanted to grow more love in the world. On that morning in Concord, Massachusetts, Reverend Gary Smith looked up from his manuscript and said, "This had better be good." And while the magnitude of this cultural moment is not nearly as strong today, while what we have now of that day is a memory, a day to remember, the tidal waves of an ongoing pandemic kept churning within us by a 24-hour news cycle, societal divisiveness, the realities of climate chaos, all the despair that is woven through this moment lead me to want to start each service with that line these days. This had better be good. Or maybe just good enough. Yes, that'll be a good prayer for us to start with. May this be good enough. May the time we have set aside here be good enough to carry us through the coming week. May this gathering of lovers and challengers be good enough to remind us of our better selves. And may the words and the music we share this hour be good enough to remind us that we are whole and holy, striving and thriving, not close to done and definitely not done trying. And that is good enough for now. Come, let us worship together. And next week, once we have some things working, you're going to join me in the chalice lighting words. This week, say them along if you know them. They will sound familiar to you. And Bert Meek, our worship associate this morning, is going to light our chalice. From Reverend Leslie Takahashi. All that we have ever loved and all that we have ever been stands with us on the brink of all that we aspire to create. A deeper peace, a larger love, a more embracing hope, a deeper joy in this life we share. And now, if you would, please join in singing along to the hymn led by our Desert Chorale, gathered here. It's number 389 if you have a hymnal at home. Mary will post the lyrics in the chat now.
Gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggle and the power, Spirit draw near, gathered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggle of the body, Spirit draws near, gathered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggle of the body, Spirit draws near, Spirit draw near, Spirit draw near.
Peter. Hi, friends. Today's story is The Way to Start a Day by Tucson's very own Bird Baylor and illustrated by Peter Parnell. And although we're not starting a brand new thing, it feels in a lot of ways like today is a new start. It is a new day. The way to start a day is this. Go outside, face the east, and greet the sun with some kind of blessing or chant or song that you made up yourself and you keep for early morning. The way to make the song is this. Don't try to think what words you will use until you are standing there alone. When you feel the sun, you'll feel the song too. Just sing it. But don't think you're the only one who ever worked this magic. Your cavemen siblings knew what to do. They sang to help the sun come up and lifted their hands to its power. The morning needs to be sung to. A new day needs to be honored. People have always known that. Didn't they chant at dawn in the sun temples of Peru? And leap and sway to Aztec flutes in Mexico, and drum sunrise songs in the Congo, and ring 1,000 small gold bells in China. Didn't the pharaohs of Egypt say the only sound at dawn should be the sound of songs that please the morning sun? They knew what songs to sing. People always seemed to know. And everywhere they knew what gifts the sun wanted. In some places they gave gold. In some places they gave flowers. In some places sacred smoke blown to the four directions. Some places feathers and good thoughts. Some places fire. But everywhere they knew to give something. And everywhere they knew to turn their faces eastward as the sun came up. Some people still know. When the first pale streak of light cuts through the darkness, wherever they are, those people make offerings and send strong, mysterious songs to the sun. They know exactly how to start the day. Their blessings float on the wind over Pueblo cornfields in New Mexico, and you'll hear their morning songs in villages in Africa, and they salute the sunrise ceremonially in the high, cold mountains of Peru. Today, long before dawn, they were already waiting in Japan with prayers, and they were gathering at little shrines in India with marigolds in their hands. They were bathing in the sacred Ganges River as the sun came up. And high on a mesa edge in Arizona, they were holding a baby towards the sun. They were speaking the child's new name so the sun would hear and know that child. And it had to be sunrise. It had to be that first sudden moment. That's when all the power of life is in the sky. Some people say there is a new sun every day, that it begins its life at dawn and lives for one day only. They say you have to welcome it. You have to make the sun happy. You have to make a good day for it. You have to make a good world for it to live its one day life in. And the way to start, they say, is just by looking east at dawn. When they look east tomorrow, you can too. Your song will be an offering. And you'll be one more person in one more place and one more time in the world saying, hello, sun, letting it know you are there. If the sky turns a color the sky never was before, just watch it. That's part of the magic. That's the way to start a day.
Thank you, Jamili. I always appreciate hearing your stories, and it's wonderful to have that part of our service this morning. It's time now for the UUCT offering. The life of our congregation has continued throughout this pandemic. And even though we are not meeting right now in person, our congregation still depends on your financial support. To support our congregation, you can send a check to the office. You can go online to uuctucson.org/donate, or you can text your donation to 833-361-5796. While you do this, let us remember that we have been warmed by fires which we did not build. We have drunk from wells that we did not dig. It is with gratitude that we accept your financial contributions today. Thank you, Chris. I always love to hear you play. It's time now to return actually to our tradition of joys and sorrows. All of us carry both joy and sadness inside. These emotions may not be obvious to those around us, but they are very real and very present for us. Each of us needs a time and a place to honor those feelings. Remember that our earth is strong. It can hold our pain and our joy and our love and our anger. It has been so many months since our shared bowl has been included in our Sunday services. But remember, this bowl will hold the big rocks, which represent the collective celebrations and mournings all of us share. It will also hold the much smaller stones to signify individuals' joys and sorrows. Let us celebrate today the breathtaking beauty of our desert with our mountains now green with life. Let us also not forget the thousands of lives taken prematurely by this pandemic, which continues to ravage our country and the world. Water is life. Water is what each of us is made of, and we use this jug just like those that no more deaths leave in the desert in their efforts to offer life-saving water to those whose journey to our country, a journey in pursuit of safety and opportunity. As we pour out this water, let us all remember that those desert people who first came to this place, we honor the Hohokam, the Yavapai, the Tohono O'odham, the Yaqui, and the many, many more indigenous people who no longer exist as tribal entities here in Arizona. So, if you have a joy this morning or a sorrow that you want to honor, I invite you to type it into the chat or speak it out loud wherever you are. As you do that, Reverend Bethany will place pebbles into the water to symbolize the joys and the sorrows within our community. May the ripples of healing and the ripples of celebration spread far beyond the confines of this bowl.
Spirit of life, that some call community, be with us here and now as we hold all that is stirring in our community, including all that is stirring here in the sanctuary. We are in beta, folks. We think of those visitors joining us this morning, bringing all they are visiting, all they bring, welcome. Think of Justin, who died this week, far too young. We lift up the joy of seeing people we recognize here in our sanctuary space. Joy that a certain grandmother, a certain mother is coming to Tucson this week. Joy of being here and sorrow of not being there. for all these joys and these sorrows, these memories of family and friends who have passed. We hold a moment of collective silence. These words of prayer, which you will soon hear, were written soon after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. And we read them now after spending 20 years at war that emerged in response to those attacks, with all of the emotions that have grown and shifted in us over time. Please tune in to those emotions you are carrying, you are having, and join as Bert and I read this prayer from Rabbi Arthur Waskow, edited by Reverend Sarah Gibb-Millspaugh. For vibrant lives suddenly, shamelessly sacrificed.
We lift up our loss.
For the lives that continue, haunted by the pain of absence.
We lift up the ashes of our remorse. What was on, right? Is it on now?
Is it on?
I know,
You pressing multiple
oh,
buttons?
there we go. I see a green light.
Always in beta.
Should we take it again?
Perfect.
Yep.
For vibrant lives suddenly, shamelessly sacrificed.
We lift up our loss.
For the lives that continue, haunted by the pain of absence.
We lift up the ashes of our remorse.
For the images forever seared into our memories.
We lift up the ashes of our pain.
For the charred visions of peace and the dry taste of fear.
We lift up the ashes of our grief.
For all that has been destroyed in the fire of anger.
We lift up the ashes of our disillusionment.
For deaths justified by arrogant patriotism or fanatic faith.
We lift up the ashes of our shame.
As we cast these ashes into the troubled waters of our times, O Spirit among us, beyond us and within us, hear our plea.
By your power, may these ashes make fertile the soil of our future, and by your mercy, may these ashes nourish the seeds of loving kindness.
For the ways humanity pursues violence, not understanding.
We lift up the stones of our anger.
For ethnic, religious, and national boundaries to our compassion.
We lift up the stones of our fear.
For the ways we cast blame and create enemies.
We lift up the stones of our self-righteousness.
Dissolving the ashes of our grief and the hardness of our hearts.
O cleansing waters, wash us towards justice and towards peace.
O cleansing waters, wash us all towards justice and peace. Amen.
Olam chesed hibaneh, la da 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 da. Olam chesed hibaneh, la da 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 da. Olam chesed hibaneh, la da da. I will build this world in love. La da 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 da. You must build this world in love. La da 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 da. If we build this world in love, da 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 da, then God will build this world in love. Da 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 da. Olam Hesed Ivaneh. Da 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 da. Olam Hesed Ivaneh. Da 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 da. Olam Hesed Ivaneh. Da 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 da. Olam Hesed Ivaneh. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. I want to read a poem to you this morning. It's from the National Public Radio. Last year, they put out a challenge to their listeners to send in poems, each of which had to start with the line, "What I learned about grief from the pandemic." NPR has a poet in residence, Kwame Alexander, last year, and he pulled together segments of what people wrote in that he found particularly moving. He titled this poem, this crowdsourced poem, "If the Trees Can Dance, So Can I." What I am learning about grief is that it sits in the space between laughs. It comes in the dark. It steals the warmth from the bed covers. It threads sleep with thin tendrils. Grief is a hauntingly familiar song, and I cannot remember the words. What I am learning about grief is that it rolls in like a heavy mist. It settles into the crevices and lingers on the skin. It visits and then visits again, lurking under my chair, and when I'm not watching, it reaches out with her tiny claws and bats at my ankles. Grief sneaks up on you. You find yourself on your couch with a well of rage living in the pit of your stomach and nowhere for it to go, and it chokes you. What I am learning about grief is that it can come like a whisper, or perhaps a storm, loud as thunder. It leaves a hollow to be filled with new planting. And when you wake for another day that feels oddly the same as the last day, it crawls right back into your lap, an ocean of tears, so you can vary the crawl with the backstroke or the breaststroke or the butterfly. At some point, you know that drowning is no longer an option. What I am learning about grief is that it is a language. Suffering has its own speech, and it will not go away just because you do not look it in the eye. Grief rides shotgun when you go out to old familiar places. Eventually, you will get closer, and he will say, "See, it's not so bad. I've got your back." This pandemic, this tragedy, this fulcrum of life is a shovel, unearthing secrets that we wish would stay buried. I learned that I am ashamed that I love solitude. These hard times call for soft people. There's softness and stillness in staying home, in distractions that are now deleted, in a togetherness that stretches over great distances. What I am learning about grief is not found in mint leaves floating in a glass of tears, boiled thrice over. It's an acquired taste, which we will never crave. Grief likes nachos, staying up late, watching Scandinavian murder shows, and sleeping in and eating cake for breakfast. It drips like water. Grief gets in everywhere through the small unseen fissures in the ceiling. You can ignore it like dust and just keep yourself too busy with laundry and with living. Grief shows up unannounced, like when your husband tells you last October that he's never loved you and asks your permission to leave. So, you burrow the ache into a carefully guarded well, and you wonder if that means that the memories all have to go there as well. What I am learning about grief is that it can turn you into someone that you do not want to be. Or it can help you become someone you never thought that you could be, because it transcends color, race, religion, and gender. Grief is that it's an old lover who just won't leave, trying to hold your hand once more, that it aches in the arches of your feet, that its mother is loss, grief's father is change, so make room for it. Grief is that tiny losses add up, that the missed first party that my son was not able to attend, the school days that he yearns for to be with his friends once more. I tell him it will all be over soon. What I am learning about grief, I learned some time ago. You need to knead grief like you would knead bread. You need to weave grief as you would weave thread. Remember, there is no vaccine against it. You cannot develop antibodies against it. Grief is something that I have and something you have. But in these times, it is something we all have. Grief is anger. Grief is denial. It is chaotic laughter from splintered memories. It is jagged cries and single tears. It is numb. It is indifferent. It is the pinprick of light, though, promising a slow semblance of normality that might return. What I am learning about grief is to acknowledge its presence, its many forms and guises, and then to use it while reaching out, connected to everyone else who is braving this same storm. What I am learning about grief is that it is still learning about me. It is learning that I am strong, I am resilient. I remember that if the trees can keep dancing, then so can I.
September 11th was the first day of school for my 7th grade class in suburban Boston. We were in school all day, unknowing about all that was unfolding. You see, the planes had left from Logan Airport just a dozen miles from our town, and the administrators had reason to believe that some of our parents were flying that day. Some of them were. I got off the school bus at 3 p.m. and walked up my street. My dad's car is in the driveway. He was rarely, never home before 6. I walked in the front door and my parents were watching the news. I turned my head just in time to see the playback. I don't remember what my parents said, but I do remember feeling overwhelmed and confused and scared. My dad had been evacuated from his high-rise office in Boston that morning for fear of future attacks. That night, we went to church, and we sat next to a friend whose coworkers had been on one of the planes. I was 1 degree of separation from a dozen or more people who died that day. More than a few family friends were supposed to be in those towers, but weren't for this or that reason. We all have our story. I got a call from my grandmother that afternoon. I might have spoken with her longer than I spoke with my parents. Remember, I was a teenager. And my grandmother said something that struck me the wrong way that day. She said, "It's time to feel united as Americans." But I did not feel united to my country. Alongside the deep grief for all the people who had died, all the first responders risking everything, alongside all that, I was angry at my country. Angry at the anti-Muslim sentiments before the ashes had even settled. Angry at the xenophobia and the nationalism that arose in the form of brutality and hatred and murder. Angry that the attack was used to justify one war, then another, ill-advised by some from the beginning. I was angry, and I stayed angry for a long time. I was not proud to be an American. It wasn't until about a decade later, when I was traveling abroad for 8 months and learned that every country, every culture has its shadow side, it was only then that I began to embrace my identity as an American. I stopped being just angry and accepted the nuance of being American without having to accept all of what American culture is and offers. I share this story amongst all the stories we've heard this weekend, not because I need you to hear, not because I need to know about your anger or whatever emotion you had, and not because I want you to be angry too, although some of you were and some of you are. I share my story because in retrospect, I wasn't just angry all those years. I was grieving the loss of connection to my cultural identity. And this morning, as you can tell, we are talking about grief. It's not exactly a welcome back, but it's the message I've got. Talking about grief, how we move grief, what happens when grief gets stuck, like that anger got stuck in me. This past March, many of us in religious leadership skimmed through readings from a year before that we had read to our congregations at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020 to keep some hope alive. And I realized that we were so out of touch in 2020 with the reality of a full year of loss and isolation. Those dreams of taking up a new hobby, bread making, chicken raising, whatever it was, were unfulfilled and in retrospect naive in some ways. The thoughts of thinking of this time as a Sabbath, time of rest, stung both ways, both for those of us who were feeling a little too much Sabbath in our lives, and for those of us still yearning for that hypothetical break in the midst of working, parenting, eating, breathing, surviving, working, parenting, eating, breathing, surviving. The words that attempted to inspire our communities to come together in mutual aid hurt deep because of how much more divided we have become. But this crowdsourced poem from Kwame Alexander that Bert read, asking people to finish that phrase, "What I'm learning about grief," it cut through that year and those unrealized visions of March 2020. And the reflections, at least for me, still resonate. We have spent 18 months grieving, collectively and individually, not only the deaths from COVID-19, but those deaths and losses that we haven't properly mourned in the same ways, grieving the disconnection from our friends, from our family, from our community, from our congregation. And there's been the grieving over the literal loss of time for those of us feeling in or close to the last few active years of our lives. There has been so much to grieve. And a work often cited when we talk about grief is that of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Stages of Grief. I think many of you have heard them: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. You have felt these things in your own grieving, I'm sure. Maybe a bit more of one than the other, and perhaps more of one than you'd prefer to have ever felt. She used the word stages, which gives this false pretense that grief moves in a straight line. It doesn't. We know that. Dr. Ross knew that. And there's another misconception about the origin of Dr. Ross's theory that I think is important to understand. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's theory of grieving is actually a theory of dying. She learned about these stages of grief by visiting people who were dying in hospitals. This was after the time when most people died at home and before the hospice care industry was as large as it is. So in hospitals in those days, when it became clear that someone was dying, the medical professionals who had been tasked with preserving life whenever possible didn't really know exactly what to do, not all of them. So Dr. Ross started visiting people who were alone in their hospital rooms, often in their final days, to learn about near death. And what became known as the stages of grief came from these dying people: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. The way I see it, these are not stages of grieving. These are practices of grieving. These are emotions we have throughout our lives on the backside of any loss, not just death. And we practice these emotions in small and large doses for that ultimate grieving that will come at the end for each and all, the loss of our own body from this world. We grieve as practice for our death. But grieving while alive is different, right? Because you have to live afterwards. And it seems so simple, but I know us, and I know that some of us get stuck intellectually in this. We know this intellectually, and yet we have so few practices to learn to live with our grief. We learn to grieve from friends who've been through it, who offer their own practices over cups of coffee or long walks or a dog-eared book. We learn to grieve from trial and error, nearly losing ourselves and somehow finding our way back. And still, like so many other practices in our culture, Americans, and especially white Americans, tend to grieve alone or with a few close friends as if it were the only way. It's not. It's not the only way, and you know that, at least in part, because you have chosen to be part of this community that names the reality of death, that honors the grieving process, and that wants to know how you really are. What is your practice of grieving? Is it solitary or communal? Does it go fast or a little too slow sometimes? How does your body tell you that you are feeling grief? Where does the grief live in you? Which practice of grieving is hardest for you? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Which is easiest? I want to ask these questions. I ask these questions, and I want them to ask them of ourselves and of one another. Because these past 18 plus months have been a collective grieving, and we, and I mean you and we, have not always been good at naming the practices of our grieving. In our specific congregation, I noticed that we are pretty quick to name our depression, but we rarely speak about our practices of anger explicitly. Sometimes it comes out sideways, but no one says, I'm angry because I'm grieving, or rarely does that happen. So I ask, what would it look like to practice being grieving angry with each other, and understand that this is a practice of grieving, not an emotion that will divide us if we get stuck there? What if we saw our anger not as something to be avoided, but as a practice? If we can name the anger, show the anger, hold space for the anger, or whatever stage of grief you need more practice at, maybe it will help us move through this grieving. What if we don't seek healing, seek some relief from this grief? Trauma specialist and author Resmaa Menakem says that, quote, trauma over time becomes decontextualized if there's no reprieve or no repair. Menakem says that trauma, grief can get stuck in our bodies. And when it gets stuck, when grief gets stuck, it becomes the trauma that becomes the reaction to the next loss or the next betrayal or the next aggression, even if it's unrelated to that initial grief. And one of the body practices that he encourages to release the trauma from wherever it is in our body, specifically our hips, is swaying or rocking, right? And when I think of that image of the widow who's lost their spouse or the parent who's lost a child, I often see them swaying with grief. So it makes some sense to me. We sway to release our grief. Where do you hold grief in your body? And how might you let go, relax there? We locate the grief to know what needs to be treated, just like any other physical ailment. Grief, untreated, binds us, restricts us, prevents us from growing into our full and healed and liberated selves. Like how I was stuck in my anger after September 11th. For a decade, I was grieving my relationship to my country, and that was expressed through anger alone, maybe teenage angst, but definitely some anger too. Once I was able to grieve, fully grieve, not just be angry at the loss of my relationship to my country, I was able to see what was worth keeping of that relationship. I was stuck, and then my grief moved, and I became unstuck. But sometimes we stay stuck, right? I find this story really interesting. According to someone who knew her well, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, that person who created the theory of grief, was raging mad as she approached her final days. She couldn't even name that she was angry. She, this person who had introduced others to different emotions we have when we are dying or grieving, got stuck in one stage in the end. And I wonder, as someone in a helping profession as Dr. Ross was, if all that time spent healing others, helping others learn the stages, had prevented her own practice of grieving, getting that anger unstuck. When we don't face our grief, when we let it go without a name, when we ignore the physical feelings attached to our grieving, our grief becomes calcified, hard. Sometimes it becomes trauma reactions. Sometimes this is out of our control, but sometimes it isn't. I believe that if we give our grieving a name, if we see grieving as a practice, if we acknowledge that to grieve is to live, if we grieve in community, then we can move forward towards healing. And this is so important as we take baby and micro movements and steps towards coming back together in in-person community, because we are going to grieve and show our grief in weird ways. Remember that we haven't fully grieved online. It was never possible to do that. There are pieces of grieving that I believe need to happen in person. So as we approach coming back together in small and bigger and larger groups, we will grieve. Some of us will grieve really loudly, and some of us will grieve really softly. Some of us will be overtaken by anger and denial, and others depression and bargaining. a few saints among us will have full acceptance mastered. For now. I hope that we look out for the stages of grief in ourselves and others. I hope that we remember how much of life is learning to live with grief. I hope that when we do get angry, we remember that some anger is an expression of what has been lost. And amongst the grief, we will find the moments of joy too, I promise. That will be more a focus during our next live stream service on September 26th. Among the grieving, we will find moments of resilience to carry us forward. Hear now this echo of that poem we heard earlier. What I'm learning about grief is there's no vaccine against it. We can't develop antibodies against it. It is something I have and something you have, but in these times, it is something we have. It is anger and denial. It is chaotic laughter from splintered memories. It is jagged cries and single tears. It is numb and indifferent. It is the pinprick of light, promising a slow semblance of normality returned. What I'm learning about grief is to acknowledge its presence, its many forms and guises, then to use it, while reaching out, connected to everyone who is braving this same storm. What I'm learning about grief is that it's still learning about me, learning that we are strong and resilient. If the trees can keep dancing, so can I, and so can we. And I would love if you would sing along now with us, wherever you are, even if you aren't certain that you sound good enough, right? This collective singing, even when we are apart, is part of our grieving and our healing. So will you sing with us now, hymn number 347? If you've got a hymnal at home, Gather the Spirit. The words will also appear on your screen.
Gather the spirit of a small pond, our separate fires will kindle one flame. Witness the misery of this song, our trials in this life appear all the same. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather in hope, compassion and strength. Gather to celebrate once again.
Gather the spirit of heart and mind, seeds for the sowing are laid in store, nurtured in love and conscience refined, with body and spirit united once more. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather in hope, compassion and strength. Gather to celebrate once again. winter to spring, and summer to fall, the chorus of life resounding as one. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy, young and men. Gather in hope, compassion and strength, gather to celebrate once again.
These words of closing come from Unitarian Universalist Reverend Wayne Arneson. They're some of my favorites, and Bert is going to extinguish our chalice as I say them. Take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone.